The Chancellor says we've turned a corner, but is the UK now in a cul-de-sac?
I now call the Chancellor to make the autumn statement. Turn out.
Jeremy Hunt trumpets a 2 percentage point cut in national insurance and an almost 2% rise in the living wage. But the UK tax burden is still the heaviest since World War II, and growth forecasts are down. So will the cost of living crisis still be a cost of living crisis next year and the year after? Nick's been out gauging reaction in Jeremy Hunt's patch.
I just worry that this is a government that's running out of good ideas.
Well, they're doing the best they can, aren't they? Under the circumstances.
They're definitely the worst bunch I've ever seen in my time as a voter.
Well, we'll be speaking to the Economic Secretary, to the Treasury and to the Shadow Business Secretary. And later in the programme, the all-important analysis on the politics of this. We'll be joined by our very own powerhouse panel to ask if this changes the electoral dial ahead of the coming election. Also tonight, we're hours from an agreed temporary pause in fighting between Israel and Hamas, in which there'll be an exchange of 50 of Hamas's hostages for 150 Palestinian women and small children held in Israeli jails. Could this lead to a longer-lasting peace? Good evening. The Chancellor said that today was a proud day. He was delivering the biggest business tax cut in modern history and the largest ever tax cuts for workers, but measured against what? We're still set to the largest overall tax burden since the Second World War, and we face the prospect of very tight public spending for so-called protected departments such as defence and health and education in England, while we learned today of an implied extra cut in unprotected Whitehall departments such as justice, transport and public health. Ahead of today's autumn statement, the Chancellor said this was the moment to go for growth. But the Office for Budget Responsibility has downgraded its growth forecast. So is this really a financial statement that shows we're turning an economic corner and one that will deliver a change in the government's political fortunes? First, the economics. Here's Ben.
Kirsty, there were two central claims from the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt today as he delivered his autumn statement. First, that the country has turned a corner economically. Now, inflation has halved relative to last year. Second, that this was an autumn statement for growth down the line. Is either accurate? First, let's grapple with whether we've actually turned a corner. This shows the last round of GDP growth forecasts from the OBR in the March budget, and here's the latest ones in pink. You can see an improvement this year, but a deterioration in 2024 and in 2025. And make no mistake, the outlook for our living standards remains pretty bleak. Here's the March outlook for disposable incomes in blue, and here's the new one in pink, as you can see. Slightly better, but this dip over the next few years is still the biggest on post-war record. If this is right, it will not feel like we've turned a corner to many households. But what about those personal tax cuts? The reductions in national insurance announced by the Chancellor, those will help, won't they? Well, yes, but it's vital to put them in the context of many tax rises already in train. This shows the projected increase in tax over this Parliament before the Chancellor's measures, adding up to around 4% of GDP. And here's it after. So a very small decrease, but this is still set to be the biggest tax-raising Parliament since the Second World War. Let's illustrate this. For an employee on full-time annual earnings of £35,000, today's national insurance cut will cancel out that personal tax rise that would otherwise have caught them next year. But according to the Institute for Fiscal Studies, by 2028, they will still be paying £249 a year more in direct tax overall as a result of all the tax changes since 2021. But was this a budget that will grow the economy in the longer term? The Chancellor said his national insurance tax cuts and his business tax reform, making it possible for firms to offset their investment costs against corporation tax immediately, will deliver this. The OBR does judge that this package will make a small but lasting impact on the economy's ability to grow. That's certainly welcome. Yet it's important to note that the OBR has still, despite this boost, revised down its estimate of the economy's medium-term growth potential today from 1.8% to 1.6%. That might not sound very much, but it really matters, and it indicates we're still in a growth malaise. And while the Chancellor spoke a lot about tax, he had less to say about our public services, particularly overstretched ones like the courts and the police. That's likely because he has increased the implied post-2025 squeeze on unprotected departments' day-to-day budgets in this autumn statement. Here's the implied impact from March in terms of annual real terms growth. You can see there are increases for protected departments like health and defence and overseas aid, etc. But everything else, which includes justice and local government, seems set for a 1.5% annual contraction. Now here's the picture after the autumn statement, an even bigger implied cut to unprotected departments and also to schools. Many analysts argue that these cuts are simply implausible and these budgets will ultimately have to be topped up. The OBR itself says the Chancellor's implied spending plans are a significant and growing risk to our forecast. These deep implied spending cuts, combined with the new tax cuts, will severely limit the room for manoeuvre for whoever is Chancellor after the next general election. That's why some feel this autumn statement was as much about short-term political positioning as about growing the economy in the longer term. Kirsty.
Thanks, Ben. Well, the government has very little time to change the economic weather before a general election, but is the direction of travel one that will energise both the Tory base, shore up the blue wall, attract the red wall and keep Westminster MPs in line? The One Nation caucus has already hailed the autumn statement as compassionate and fiscally responsible. Nick's here. Tax cuts today, Nick, but not the end of the story.
That's right. Well, Jeremy Hunt did describe this as the biggest package of tax cuts since the 1980s. And in government, this is being described tonight as a down payment. In other words, it is just the beginning. And it is the firm view in Downing Street that if inflation does continue on its downward path, and it is projected to go in that direction, then we will see more tax cuts before the general election. I am told it is the hope and intention of both the Prime Minister and Chancellor that we will see those tax cuts in the spring budget. So what might we see? Maybe we'll see an income tax cut. Maybe we will see a cut to inheritance tax.
But in some ways, it was a very difficult day for the government, and more difficult by the slightly restive Westminster gang.
Yes, I mean, the government were sort of a bit upset that everyone's focusing. The OBR was saying that it's going to be the biggest tax burden since the war. They say we've had a pandemic and the energy crisis. A divided party, but a united party tonight. You were just talking about the One Nation wing. That's Jeremy Hunt's wing on the left of the party, talking about it's compassionate and fiscally responsible. From the right, I'm hearing words like, we should give this a fair win. They're very happy with the national insurance cuts. One senior figure on the right said to me, the government obviously hopes that this is going to shift the dial. If it doesn't, then this person paused and said to me, then what? So a crucial moment for Jeremy Hunt to sort of change the fortunes of this government, but also to shore up his own backyard, which is a crucial battleground. A genteel corner of the English home counties. Relative affluence and a sedate pace of life. Godalming in Surrey, which has comfortably returned Jeremy Hunt to Parliament for nearly 2 decades, but now a potential battleground for the Conservatives after 13 years in power. This is the Jolly Farmer pub, warmly mentioned by Jeremy Hunt today. This is right in the heart of his constituency and right in the heart of the blue wall. Those are those once safe Tory seats now firmly in the sights of the Liberal Democrats. Rishi Sunak is clearly worried. That's why he brought back David Cameron, who has a bit of a Heineken effect in areas like this. So a big attempt today to shore up Tory support in areas like this. And a big political message from the Chancellor. I am the agent of stability, no longer buffeted by an economy beyond our control. As master of events, I can now deliver. So 2 headline-grabbing retail offers. A 2 percentage point cut in the main employee national insurance rate and a large tax cut for business with a permanent extension of an investment tax break. But the overall tax burden is still heading to a post-war high. And on the economic fundamentals, inflation is due to fall, but growth is relatively flat.
I now call the Chancellor to make the autumn statement. Chairman.
We are delivering the biggest business tax cut in modern British history, the largest ever cut to employee and self-employed national insurance, and the biggest package of tax cuts to be implemented since the 1980s. An autumn statement for a country that has turned a corner, an autumn statement for growth, which I commend to the House.
But whoever this Prime Minister picks as the Chancellor, the truth is this: Britain is and will be worse off under the Conservatives. They have held back growth. They have crashed our economy, increased debt, trashed our public services, left businesses out in the cold and made life harder for working people.
Today he had the power to help people, to lift a finger, to right some of the wrongs of this government that he's inflicted upon them. But people aren't this government's priority. We know who goes through their priority lanes.
This statement is a deception from the Chancellor after years of unfair tax hikes. Under this Conservative government, economic growth is flatlining and public services are on their knees.
It's been a complete labour of love. Back to the Jolly Farmer pub.
Well, he's been known to frequent the place fairly regular. He does love our fish and chips.
Confirmation that Jeremy Hunt is a regular, and a welcome for his freeze in alcohol duty until August, and the wider help for business.
I mean, it's a positive thing for us, very much so, and the freezing of business rates, again, very positive, but it's not going to stop the brewers increasing their prices. And we know that, you know, there's inflationary pressure out there, and it's going to reflect one way or another in the price of a pint. But it's just good that the government's not adding to that. So, yeah, we're happy. We're happy with that news. Very, very good.
Back in Godalming, strong views about the government. I was just wondering, how do you think things are looking for this government?
For this government, absolutely ghastly. I mean, they're clearly doing pensions to try and get the grey vote. But I, as a grey vote, am just had it up to there with the 13 years of Tory misrule.
But some are supportive.
Well, they're doing the best they can, aren't they? Under the circumstances.
So difficult circumstances.
They are very difficult, yeah. We know that, but they're doing the best they can.
Evening calm in Surrey, but in the high streets and alleys, a fierce debate is underway.
Nick there. Well, earlier I spoke to the Economic Secretary to the Treasury, Bim Afalami. I began by asking him about the downgrade of UK growth in the OBR's forecasts.
So the first thing, Kirsty, is that we don't lag behind most other countries. In the G7, we have the third highest growth since 2010. And in relation to growth forecasts, what I know is that last year, our growth was actually much higher than the OBR forecast it was going to be at the time. And next year, our growth is up. The total size of the economy is up 2%, £40 billion from where it was meant to be in the March budget. So I don't accept your picture on growth at all.
So actually what you're suggesting is that the OBR isn't really worth the paper it's written on?
No, of course not. They have a very difficult job forecasting, as everybody does. But my point is that the measures we're taking today are setting the long-term foundation for growth in our economy. When I said that we are only third in the G7, that's not to say that our growth is as high as we would like. Of course it's not. That's why we're taking these measures. We've got over 100 growth measures in this autumn statement. And, you know, in the budget next year, there'll be more to come.
So what the Chancellor has announced today amounts to £19.1 billion cut in public spending, roughly equal to what the Chancellor is spending in tax cuts. So people are going to feel much more the lack of public spending and services, more than they're going to feel the benefit of tax cuts, given that actually the tax cuts don't actually measure up to the impact that inflation's had on wages and pay.
So it is not a cut in public spending. What you're referring to is spending going up less than it otherwise may have gone. We've chosen, and it's a political choice, and I accept that, we have chosen to give tax cuts to hard-working people on average earnings. I don't apologise for that, through the 2% cut in national insurance for employees and a similar set of measures for self-employed. And we've chosen to back British business through giving business tax cuts. That is the political choice we've made. I think that's a reasonable choice. But public spending at the end of the forecast period, which is 5 years, is likely to be £85 billion more than it otherwise was.
Given that actually there is, you're not changing the thresholds for tax, given the lag of other taxation that people are facing from the last 2 or 3 years, people aren't going to be better off.
Look, it's worth pointing out that we had a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic earlier on in the Parliament. That meant that the government spent over £450 billion supporting people and businesses and supporting the health of everybody in this country. That's why the debt burden and the tax burden rose. I mean, that's the fact. What we're choosing to do now is, yes, we are focusing this tax cut. It's not the end, it's the beginning. We're focusing this tax cut on working people. Someone on average earnings who's an employee will see net their taxes cut as a result of that national insurance tax cut.
How quickly net taxes cut? How quickly will they actually be taking home more money?
Well, to be clear, that what I'm saying by that is, you mentioned thresholds rising over time.
Not rising.
Or rather, thresholds staying the same over time. What I'm saying is, someone on average earnings who gets that 2% tax cut will be slightly better off, even notwithstanding that fact. And the reason why we've done that is because we know that working people, we need to back them and make sure that they contribute and they benefit from these growth measures.
Finally, Minister, the Chancellor announced a long-term cash freeze in public investment. Now, that's a significant cut, because public sector investment is way below comparable countries at the moment. Public sector investment is the way you deliver growth, isn't it? And you've got a cash freeze.
So investment is very important, and one thing that so I've talked about business investment, but some way in which we're going to get much more investment into the economy are our reforms to Solvency II. These are actually a sort of a Brexit freedom that we've taken advantage of, and our reforms to pensions more broadly that will lead to 75 billion extra pounds invested in British business, British stock market, so that that investment comes from the private sector, and we've done that through regulatory changes. So you're right that investment matters, but what we've done is through regulatory change, we're getting the private sector to invest more.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, I also spoke earlier to Labour's Shadow Business Secretary, Jonathan Reynolds. I asked him whether Labour would unfreeze tax thresholds.
We have made a principal focus of our policy platform about stronger and better economic growth. And frankly, that is the only way that we will see reasonable burdens in terms of taxation and reasonable funding of public services in future. Now, what was required in this budget, I mean, the Chancellor said it would be a budget for growth. Growth has been downgraded next year, the year after that, and the year after that. So this is about a step change in government policy that hasn't happened.
So you believe the OBR is right on this? They've downgraded the growth forecast?
I think there's no reason to doubt the OBR's growth forecast.
So, no matter, Labour's already said that a Labour government would borrow to invest, but presumably you're going to have to borrow to fund day-to-day spending in the public sector as well.
No, we've made very clear that the fiscal rules that we put forward will not allow for borrowing to day-to-day expenditure and will bring down the burden of debt as a proportion of GDP over the term of a parliament. Now, that should give us more money to invest. That is part of our plan, our Green Prosperity Plan, which actually I think is an integral part of what we've put forward, but it's also alongside our industrial strategy and planning reform and changes to the apprenticeship levy and the Brexit deal.
You'll stick with what you are, as it were, you inherit if you win the election. So there'll be no question of reinstating the 2% in NI, for example.
Well, look, we're not at this stage accepting all of the government's plans. There'll be a budget before the election.
You said you wouldn't raise taxes. Would NI be exempt from that?
Specifically on the government's cut to national insurance. Now, we opposed the rise in national insurance, so it's entirely consistent to back its reduction. But look, I think people will look at it and say, well, if you take the tax burden in this Parliament alone, that's equivalent to an extra 10 pence in the pound on national insurance. So 2 pence off, you're still worse off. The fact is people will be paying more tax at the next election than the last one. Well, those specific pledges on tax rates and thresholds
how are you
have to be...
How are you going to fund the shortfall?
Well, they have to be... The specific pledges on tax rates and thresholds have to be part of the election campaign, not at this stage before a budget. Now, I understand what you're fundamentally asking, which is the government have taken the dividend of higher inflation in terms of tax receipts and they've spent it. And that implies really tough times for the future. But it always would have, unless economic growth improved, and that's why that's
so the focus is on economic growth, but let's look at non-protected departments, because what the government has said is that the non-protected departments are they will be cut, and according to the OBR it's a 0.2.3% cut in real terms. So what would you do? You know, you've got transport, you've got environment, you've got justice, you've got public health, and we're just out of pandemic. How would you make sure they're properly funded from the get-go?
Well, look, I accept what we are seeing in terms of the government's plans is very, very worrying. There's no doubt about that in terms of the lack of a long-term, reasonable trajectory that the Chancellor has put forward today. We've identified some areas where we do switch spends. So, for instance, the changes to the non-dom tax regime for the super-rich, that goes to the health service.
That's health, it's protected anyway.
Schools. Well, it's still important to see those
it's protected, but I'm talking about transport, environment, justice, public health.
But fundamentally, even before the decisions today, on the current trajectory of economic growth, those would have been tough decisions in the next Parliament. They were already scheduled for tough decisions. That's why the focus of all of our policy is on a stronger economy. And without that, this will get really, really tough.
Okay, how are you going to create this stronger economy? This government says it's incentivising business to invest by allowing them to pay less in tax if they invest. Would a Labour government keep that in place?
Yes, it would, because we have the lowest business investment in the G7. We recognise that is a driver of low productivity and low economic growth. But on its own, it won't do what is required. It's welcome because it really compensates for the rise in corporation tax. But just the full thing that's required is, first of all, some stability. That's never been an offer from this government. A proper industrial strategy, a proper green prosperity plan, getting things built, changes to planning, the apprenticeship levy. It's the package that is necessary. So there is an element of public investment that forms a key part of our plans. But the specific departmental investment plans and delegated departmental expenditure plans, that's got to be set out in a general election.
Jonathan Reynolds, thank you very much. So what's the politics of all this? With me now is Stephen Bush with the Financial Times and Poppy Trowbridge, former Special Advisor to Chancellor Philip Hammond from 2016-2019. Good evening, both of you. I feel we're in a kind of pre-election position now. Poppy, first of all, who was the budget for? Was it for the voters of the Blue Wall? It looks from what Nick was saying that really didn't have much impact.
I think it was partly for the Tory party itself. You know, there's been such disintegration over the last year, 2 years, you could even argue sort of since Brexit, that it was first and foremost for the Tory party. It wasn't a budget, it was not a statement, except it was a budget. Yeah. So the very fact that they pulled out all the big guns shows that they're really gunning for an election and they need to secure their base first. They cannot send thousands of people out marching the streets delivering pamphlets without having the ability to say, and I'm going to put in very loose quotation marks, we cut taxes, because we know that mathematically it doesn't add up. But you know, when you find 20 quid on the back of the sofa and you spend it all in one place, even though people advise against it, you do it because it doesn't feel like yours. And that certainly happened here. That, you know, the money that they've spent was fortuitous, but it wasn't planned.
And Nick's assessment, more tax cuts coming. But I wonder just briefly on inheritance tax. They were flying the kite of inheritance tax for a wee while. What were they doing there? Just sounding it out?
Making sure they can do it in the spring, I suppose.
Yeah. So what do you think, Stephen? Bim Afalami was critical of the OBR growth forecast. I mean, we've heard this before we were here with Liz Truss being very critical of the OBR.
Well, you could kind of see him realising, sort of live in the interview, that he didn't quite want to go back into that zone, partly because of what that did to markets, partly because there are a lot of voters who are understandably very, very angry about that era, particularly if you've had to refinance your mortgage since that era. But the grain of truth there is actually the OBR has consistently been pessimistic, which is probably a good thing. You'd much rather your fiscal referee was being...
But don't you just keep second-guessing the OBR then, and you just change your stance because you think it's always going to be pessimistic?
Well, yeah, but you're still better off as the finance minister being in a situation in which you're going, oh, I have more money to spend, than going, oh dear, I have less. And in some ways, actually, that is the slight risk he's taken here, because he's used pretty much all of his headroom, particularly when you remember that the only way he can make the sums add up is by suggesting the fuel duty freeze is going to go up. Now, look, if any of your viewers believe that the fuel duty free is going to go up basically ever again under any government, I have a bridge to sell them.
But also, he didn't have that much headroom altogether. You were saying that, but not much at all. Like what, 13 billion or something?
Yeah, and I actually think that the impressive thing from a policy perspective is actually he did use most of that on, full expensing, quantum computing, the stuff which will actually get growth going. But then he's used all of his wriggle room essentially to give the Conservative rank and file this tax cut, which in electoral terms, it's
reason to live. I think of the words you're looking for.
Yeah.
Reason to live. So tell me, what about that NI cut and the fact that it's coming in January?
It's long been floated within the Conservative ranks,
of course they know that Labour back it.
They know that Labour back it, and so this was an interesting autumn statement because it, in many ways, was finishing off all the policies they'd been planning to nick from Labour, but also then doing a few very conservative ones like the tax cut, and I think also some of the very welcome business measures. They really are important for long-term growth. The problem, of course, is timing. The timing, better late than never, but it really is probably too late to see that feed through for any electoral battle.
But interesting, I was sorry to be, but on the expensing, they just went for, the hardcore machinery, the heavy industry sort of...
And there's more to it.
And they didn't go for service sector, they didn't go for financial sector, they didn't go for creative sector.
Or research and development, or other aspects
Yes, R&D particularly.
There is more to be done there, and I suspect that, in fact, I'm sure that they know there is more to be done, but this seems, when it comes to productivity in the UK, it's been a problem for decades and decades, and core to that has been quite simply investment in machinery and plants. And so they're sort of taking the top layer off it.
But more Thatcherite was, we're not going to have any public investment. HS2 seems like a distant branch line at the moment. We're not going to have any more big stuff. The government's not going to be doing any of that stuff.
Yeah, and in some ways this was a very traditional Conservative choice. What did he do with his headroom? He used it to cut taxes. Now, of course, some will say, well, what tends to happen when you have a traditional Labour Party and a traditional Conservative, you get the traditional result, the Tories win. But other people will look at the Labour Party and go, actually, is this really the right political choice? Given it's quite a big gamble, given we're going into the winter, not to put any extra money into the NHS, given the pressures that it's under to put any money into criminal justice.
1% to the NHS, 1% to education here. But on the unprotected departments, we look at public health, you look at transport, and minus 2.3 according to the OBR. That's a pretty big cut.
Yeah, in practice...
it won't even come through in...
Yeah, in practice, that bit of the autumn statement is really labelled, this will be Rachel Reeves's problem.
Yes.
Right? Look, this is not a fiscal event by a Chancellor who expects that he is going to be the one who has to make these sums add up after the budget. Because I think, look, nothing about the pattern of politics in the last half-decade would make anyone think that those very sharp cuts to unprotected departments are ever going to be delivered politically. Yeah. Essentially, the overarching, to plagiarise my colleague Robert Shrimsley, the overarching message of this budget really was, have a drink, but don't worry, Rachel Reeves will be picking up the tab.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it begs the question, who in that chamber actually wants to win the next election? Because it's not just what you say, these home-baked problems, but the world economy is not stable yet, and we are very much susceptible to that. And this doubles down on that uncertainty.
Yes, and what that did, because everybody's poring over figures today, was expose the fact that, the economy is not going back to pre-pandemic levels to 2028. So that is a pretty big task. That's like more than the term of a parliament.
Yeah, that is the thing. Yeah, in some ways, I don't think it is going to be a 1992 style election result, but in some ways, 1992 was a very good election to lose. I think if the Labour Party had won that election, we'd probably be talking about a very different political history than the one which folded out. And I suspect if I were a Conservative or a Labour strategist, I would want to win for professional pride, but precisely for all the reasons Poppy's saying, I'd go, not too sure about that one.
And if you are right that there is just no way the Conservative Party can win, then they can't go wrong by trying to shore up their base and ensure the people that go out and hit the streets handing out leaflets feel confident enough to do it. Otherwise, they've already given up the ghost.
Thank you very much indeed for having to stop me there. You'll be back many times. Later this week, we expect the beginning of the highly emotionally charged exchange of hostages for prisoners in Gaza and Israel at the start of a 4-day pause in fighting brokered by the US, the Qataris, Egypt and the International Committee of the Red Cross. Joe Biden said the deal would end an unspeakable ordeal for the hostages and alleviate the suffering of innocent Palestinian families. We expect 50 hostages, women and children, to be released in what's described as 4 batches of 12, and in turn 150 Palestinian women and children will be freed. A statement from the office of the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, said that the release of an additional 10 hostages each day would result in an added pause day. Hamas, which the UK, the US and other powers class as a terrorist organisation, said the deal would give Palestinians time to recover after an intense Israeli air and ground assault, which its government in Gaza said has killed more than 14,000 people. So, could this be a moment without violence if it holds, and could it pave the way for an eventual peace? Here's Joe.
We are at war, and we will continue to fight until we reach all our goals. Prime Minister Netanyahu could not have been clearer. This is just a pause. But as international pressure for a ceasefire grows, could it eventually lead to peace? Since the 7th of October, the hostages' families have been a powerful force, accusing the Israeli government of prioritising the destruction of Hamas over the rescuing of their relatives. The fact that 50 are now being released will prove to many that negotiations can work.
In the end, the combination of the families and President Biden were decisive in pushing the government into accepting a partial deal, only 50 out of the 239 hostages. That said, it all depends on what will happen on the 5th day, whether or not war resumes as if nothing happened and this was just an artificial lull or hiatus, or Hamas comes forth with a second possible deal, which necessitates or creates the pressures for an extension of the ceasefire.
Israeli society has undoubtedly been hardened by the horrors of October the 7th. There is a mood here that eventually Hamas must be destroyed. But it is not only Israeli public opinion that will decide government policy. A poll in the US last week found that 68% of Americans now wanted a ceasefire.
America has provided Israel with essentially a blank check for years with support, and has not really made any significant demands, in response to providing this blank check. And so we are seeing, a huge shift in the American population with trying to pressure the White House and Congress. However, that has not yet transferred to a change in policy.
And for watchers of the region's politics, it is whether that policy changes that will determine if this pause lasts beyond 5 days.
Well, it depends how much pressure is actually exerted on Israel. Israel has made it very clear since the announcement of this ceasefire that this is simply a ceasefire and that this changes nothing in terms of their operational objective, which is to destroy Hamas and to ensure that the Strip is not going to be governed by anything similar to Hamas. Hamas, on the other hand, appear to want to engage in negotiations. They've made that clear from the outset. During the first 2 weeks of the war, they offered a very similar deal for much less. So it seems as though a lot of the pressure that needs to be exerted on Israel if we are to guarantee that any kind of serious, permanent arrangement is to be reached.
Any extension to the current 5-day deal would involve more hostages being released and more aid being allowed into Gaza. For the Norwegian Refugee Council, any deal is welcome, but
hostages should not be a bargaining chip. All the hostages should be released. It sets a very bad precedent if you take hostages and then you use them as a bargaining chip for a political or strategic goal. Nor should the access to civilians be a bargaining chip. What is this? That we can help children, feed children, if there is some specific conditions met on the other side. We have a right and an obligation to help all people everywhere.
Even this evening, as the pause approached, the fighting continued, adding to the thousands of deaths this conflict has caused. Any hostages released, any respite for the civilians of Gaza will be welcome, but very few think that this will be the end of their suffering.
Joe there, and since we went on air, it has been reported that the release of hostages will not now happen before Friday at the earliest, and the ceasefire will also be delayed. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Jal Farin, a former U.S. ambassador to Yemen, a counter-terrorism expert, and senior fellow at the Middle East Institute. Ambassador Farin, thank you very much for joining us tonight. First, we did expect that the hostages, the release of hostages and the transfer of prisoners would happen tomorrow, but it's a delay to Friday. Should we read anything particular into this?
Well, I think only that these agreements, that the implementation is always very complicated. I understand that on the Israeli side, there's a requirement that they give the courts an opportunity to review the individuals who are to be released from Israeli prisons, and that may be a delay in the process. And it's always a very difficult tango that the two sides are going to be in.
So let's just look at the negotiations and who's been leading in those negotiations. So you've got the Qataris leading on it. Where do you think the Americans have been within the negotiations? I mean, have they been exerting a lot of pressure on Israel?
Well, I think that clearly the Israeli government has responded to what they're hearing from the Biden administration. That was an important component. And also, of course, that the U.S. has been very much involved with passing messages through the Qatari channel to Hamas. And so among the 4 or 5 parties, the Israelis, Hamas, the U.S., Qatar, and Egypt also playing a role, each of them passing messages, coming up with ideas, and trying to get the two key parties, Israel and Hamas, onto the same page.
But how much pressure do you think President Biden is putting on Benjamin Netanyahu just now?
Well, I think probably quite a lot for a couple of reasons. One, as you know, there are among the hostages U.S. citizens, and that is an important factor for President Biden. And then the other point, which your correspondent noted, is that there is a strong view in the United States in favor of a ceasefire. The president needs to respond to that, particularly within his own Democratic Party.
Well, just on that, the increase in support for a ceasefire in America, how much do you think would the Biden administration like to see a government in Israel without Benjamin Netanyahu at its head?
Oh, I think that's been a truism for many, many years. The reality is that it's not so much what the United States wants to see, but what do the Israeli people want to see. And there seems to be a strong mood within the Israeli political environment to see new leadership on their side.
You didn't see, but you probably heard Jens England saying there, that it's dreadful to have hostages as a bargaining chip. It's the reality of this, though, isn't it? And I wonder if you can see when the initial 50 hostages are transferred, and they're apparently going to be transferred in batches, whatever that means. And as you say, it's a very delicate system to get the Palestinian prisoners out and to get the hostages out as well. What are the chances, do you think, if this is a successful maneuver, whether one, the offer from Benjamin Netanyahu to say, well, 10 hostages each day, and we'll delay any return to any violence. I mean, what do you think the chance of this is being, in a way, a corridor, a very narrow corridor to some kind of peace?
Absolutely. I think that it is something, and it would be hard, in my view, for the parties to go back to open conflict after reaching this agreement. And so I think that as the two sides continue to negotiate, the likelihood that there will be something that is more sustainable is going to increase. But we should also understand that this is not going to be a permanent solution to the problem. The permanent solution requires something much broader that involves the West Bank as well as Gaza.
Thank you very much indeed, Ambassador Firestein.
Thank you.
Well, just before we go, news in from Holland, where voters have been at the polls to decide who will lead their country into a new political era. And I'm joined by Anna Holligan. Anna, what is the latest and what is going to happen next?
It's fair to say this is looking like a pretty seismic result, sending shockwaves through Dutch politics and society. This woman was widely tipped to be the first ever female Prime Minister of the Netherlands. We are inside the party that was supposed to be the party celebrating her arrival. In fact, it looks as though the far-right, anti-Islam, anti-immigration, populist politician with radical views, Geert Wilders, is going to become the largest party. That means he will be tasked with forming the next coalition government of the Netherlands. However, many of the other parties have already said they won't work with him, and yet that will play into the hands of those voters who have voted for him, those disenfranchised, marginalised voters who say the mainstream parties simply aren't listening to them. And the irony in all of this is that Dylan Yesilgaz, the leader of the VVD centre-right party who took over from Mark Rutte, the Netherlands' longest-serving Prime Minister, has been accused of opening the door to Geert Wilders by flirting with his ideas, saying she would be prepared to work with him in a coalition. So now the future is looking very uncertain, and we are expecting the actual results on Thursday. From that point on, the complicated process of trying to negotiate the next coalition government will begin.
Thank you very much indeed, Anna. Speaking from a very busy part of the city. Let's look at some of the front pages. First of all, tax burden surges despite Hunt cuts, says the Financial Times. The Daily Mail, let's hope it's just the start, but with the total burden still vast. Biggest tax cut since the 1980s, says the Mail. And The Sun, New Year's woohey, £450 off national insurance, £18 a week rise in state pension, and duty frozen on all your party booze. Well, that's all from us tonight. Mark's here tomorrow. Until then, sleep well. Good night.